She walked into his garage with a termination letter in her hand and a decision already made in her mind. Evelyn Sterling, billionaire, CEO, the kind of woman who built empires before breakfast, had driven 40 minutes outside the city to deliver the news personally. She believed that was the respectful thing to do. She never expected to find that inside a mechanic's garage. Before you watch this story unfold, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Then drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. Don't go. The termination letter sat on the passenger seat of Evelyn Sterling's car the entire drive out. Crisp, white, folded in thirds inside a company envelope with the Sterling Dynamics logo embossed on the upper left corner. She hadn't sealed it. She told herself that was because she might need to make last-minute adjustments. The honest answer, which she wasn't quite ready to give herself, was that something about the drive had made her uneasy in a way she couldn't name. The GPS took her off the interstate 20 minutes before she expected, routing her through a neighborhood of older homes, the kind with detached garages and chain-link fences and basketball hoops rusting at the end of cracked driveways. Not poverty, exactly. More like a place where people had decided that the size of their house wasn't the most important thing about their life. Evelyn noticed that. She noticed most things. It was what made her dangerous in a boardroom and occasionally exhausting at dinner parties. She parked at the curb in front of 412 Callaway Street at 4:17 on a Friday afternoon. The house was small but not neglected. The front lawn had been recently mowed. There were 2 potted plants flanking the front door. Nothing fancy, just ordinary geraniums in terracotta pots, but they'd been watered and they were alive, which told her something about the man who lived here. On the driveway sat a faded blue pickup truck with a bumper sticker from a state park she'd never visited. A child's bicycle leaned against the side of the house, pink with silver handlebar streamers that had seen better days. She sat in the car for a moment, checked her phone. 3 missed calls from her VP of operations, which she ignored, looked again at the house. Get it done, Evelyn. She grabbed the envelope, stepped out, and walked up the driveway. She knocked on the front door and waited. No answer. She could hear something faintly from the back of the property, a metallic sound, rhythmic and careful, like someone working with precision rather than urgency. She followed the driveway around the side of the house toward the detached garage. And as she got closer, the sound grew clearer. Not banging, not the chaotic noise of someone fixing something broken. This was deliberate, controlled. The garage door was rolled up halfway. Warm light spilled from inside. Evelyn ducked slightly and stepped through. What she saw stopped her completely. The car occupied nearly the entire space. It was low, aggressively low, with a body shape that didn't belong anywhere near this neighborhood or this zip code. The lines were unmistakably motorsport, a long tapered nose, an open cockpit, rear aerodynamic elements that rose from the back of the car like something designed in a wind tunnel rather than a home garage. The surface was mostly bare carbon fiber and raw aluminum, unpainted, which gave it the look of something still becoming itself. Wiring harnesses ran in organized bundles along the firewall. The suspension geometry was exposed and impossibly complex. It was, without question, the most extraordinary piece of privately built engineering Evelyn had ever seen outside of a professional facility. Standing beside it, crouching near the left rear corner with a torque wrench in one hand and a small notebook open on the floor beside him, was Mason Hale. He hadn't heard her come in. He was 32, though he looked slightly older in the way that men do when they've been through things that age isn't responsible for. Dark hair that needed a cut. Oil on his forearms, on the knees of his work jeans, a faint streak of it along his jaw that he'd clearly wiped there with the back of his hand at some point and forgotten about. He was reading something in the notebook, then adjusting, then reading again, a quiet, focused loop that had nothing performative about it. "Mason Hale?" Evelyn said. He looked up. Not startled, more like a man accustomed to being interrupted and having learned to absorb it without breaking his concentration entirely. His eyes were dark and steady. He assessed her the same way she suspected he assessed everything, quickly, but without rushing the conclusion. "Miss Sterling," he said. Not a question. He'd known she was coming. He set the torque wrench down, closed the notebook, and stood. wiped his right hand on a shop rag before offering it. She shook it. "You can call me Evelyn," she said, which was not something she usually offered to employees at his level. Something about the room was doing that to her. "Sure," he said. He didn't offer anything in return, didn't say you can call me Mason the way most people would have, filling the space with social lubrication. He just let the silence sit there. It was, Evelyn thought, either confidence or indifference. She hadn't decided which. "I drove out personally because I thought it deserved that," she said, and held out the envelope. Mason looked at it but didn't take it. He looked at her. "You want to tell me what's in it first?" he said. "It's a restructuring decision," she said. "Your position at the regional facility is being eliminated. The severance is generous, I made sure of that. 12 weeks, full benefits continuation, and a strong letter of recommendation for any shop in the region." She paused. "You're a talented mechanic, Mason. This isn't a reflection of your work." The words came out exactly as she'd practiced them in the car. Professional, compassionate, final. Mason didn't react the way people usually did. There was no flash of hurt, no tightening around the jaw, no, of course there is, bitterness. He just nodded once, slowly, and his eyes drifted back to the car beside him, the way a man's eyes drift back to whatever he actually cares about in the middle of a conversation he's tolerating. "Okay," he said. Just that. "Okay." Evelyn found herself slightly off balance. She'd had people cry. She'd had people argue. She'd once had a man throw a stapler at the wall, but not at her, but still. She was very good at managing emotional reactions because she'd seen most of them. Quiet acceptance from someone who clearly wasn't indifferent wasn't something she encountered often. "You're not going to say anything?" she asked. "What would you like me to say?" "I don't know." "Something." He turned to look at her properly then. There was no hostility in it, but there was something, a measured quality, like he was deciding how much of himself this moment deserved. "I knew the regional facility was on the list," he said. "I heard about the restructuring 6 weeks ago from someone in logistics. I've had time to think about it." He glanced at the car. "I've been thinking about other things anyway." Evelyn looked at the car again. She couldn't stop looking at it. "What is this?" she said. "A project." "I can see it's a project. What kind of project?" He was quiet for a moment, not reluctant, more like he was considering the shortest, accurate answer. "Formula-style open-wheel racer," he said. "Custom chassis, bespoke suspension geometry, naturally aspirated 4-cylinder with a modified induction system, carbon Kevlar composite body. About 6 years of work." "You built this yourself?" "Most of it. My father started it. I've been finishing it." Evelyn walked slowly around the front of the car. She wasn't entirely sure what she was looking for. She was an engineer herself, technically, though her career had taken a hard turn into corporate leadership before she'd spent serious time in fabrication. But she knew enough. She knew what thoughtful design looked like versus inspired design versus this. The nose section alone had aerodynamic detailing that reminded her of cars she'd seen in professional paddocks. The front wing end plates had cascade elements, small, precisely shaped fins that modified airflow in ways that didn't happen by accident or instinct. They happened through calculation. Serious calculation. She crouched down and looked at the underside of the front diffuser. "These vortex generators," she said. "You designed these?" "Yeah." "The angle of attack on the secondary element." She stood up, looking at him. "Did you model this computationally or by hand?" Something shifted in his expression. Barely, like a door that had been closed moving a fraction of an inch. "Both," he said. "CFD for the initial iterations, then hand calculations to verify the boundary layer behavior at lower Reynolds numbers. The software was making assumptions about surface roughness that I didn't trust on the carbon sections." Evelyn stared at him. He'd just described a fluid dynamics validation methodology that she'd last heard in a graduate-level aeronautical engineering seminar. "Where did you study?" she said. "Georgia Tech." "Mechanical engineering?" "Mechanical and aeronautical, double major." He said it flatly, like it was information about someone else. "Graduated 2016, top of the program." The termination envelope was still in Evelyn's hand. She had forgotten she was holding it. "You have a master's?" Yeah. In aerodynamic systems with a focus on automotive applications. She looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes without aggression, without pride, without the I told you so energy that she would have entirely deserved. He just looked at her the way he'd looked at everything since she walked in, like a man who had learned to exist in a world that consistently got him wrong, and had made a kind of peace with it. Mason, she said carefully, you have a graduate degree in aeronautical engineering and you've been working as a line mechanic at a regional service facility. Yes. For how long? 4 years. Why? He didn't answer immediately. He turned and picked up his torque wrench, set it on the workbench in its proper place. She noticed he had a place for everything, organized by size and function, with a precision that said something about his mind. And then he turned back to her. My daughter starts school at 7:15, he said. She gets out at 3:30. The regional facility is 12 minutes from her school. The hours were flexible when I needed them to be. He paused. That's why. Evelyn said nothing. She felt something she rarely felt in professional contexts. Ashamed of herself. Not embarrassed. Ashamed. There's a difference. You have a daughter, she said. Emma. She's 9. Is there... She stopped. I'm sorry. Is there a mother in the picture? Not really, not anymore. He said it without emotion, but with a kind of deliberate steadiness that told her the steadiness was intentional, that it had been built over time, and that it cost him something to maintain it. Emma's with her grandmother on Friday afternoons. I usually get a couple hours out here. He nodded toward the car. Evelyn looked at the car. She looked at the notebook on the floor, still open to whatever page he'd been reading when she walked in. She looked at the organized workbench, the careful wiring, the years of incremental, patient, unpaid work that had produced something that didn't belong in a home garage. Not because it was too rough, but because it was too good. Your father started this, she said. He was a motorsport engineer. Spent 20-something years in professional racing, crew chief, then chief engineer, did a stint as a technical director late in his career. This was his retirement project. Mason looked at the car, and for the first time since she'd walked in, something in his face softened in a way that cost him something, just briefly. He never got to finish it. How long ago did you lose him? 6 years. She did the math. 6 years ago, Mason would have been 26, which put him somewhere in the middle of a promising engineering career. She thought about what he'd said. After losing his father, and then she thought about the daughter and the divorce that wasn't quite a divorce, and the 12-minute commute, and 4 years of being the talented mechanic nobody thought to ask harder questions about. Mason, she said, I owe you an apology. He raised an eyebrow. Fractional. For what? For walking in here with a letter in my hand and a conclusion already reached. She held up the envelope, then set it down on his workbench. I assumed I knew what I was walking into. I didn't. He looked at the envelope on his workbench, then at her. Ms. Sterling. Evelyn. Evelyn. He said it like he was testing whether it fit. You didn't know what to ask because you didn't have a reason to ask it. I was a line mechanic. The facility was being cut. That's a straightforward decision. He shrugged slightly. I don't blame you for that. I do, she said. He had no response to that, which was, Evelyn was beginning to understand, fairly typical for Mason Hale. He didn't fill silences with noise. He didn't perform graciousness. He just absorbed what was said and let it mean what it meant. She looked around the garage again, the organized chaos of a 6-year obsession, the suspended aerodynamic elements hanging from the ceiling, joists that she now understood were test pieces, experiments that had been evaluated and either incorporated or discarded. The bookshelves along the back wall, not novels, not magazines, but technical references. SAE papers, computational fluid dynamics textbooks, bound notebooks that matched the one on the floor, a whole row of them, what looked like 6 years of handwritten engineering data. Has anyone else seen this? She asked. My father's old colleagues came by when I first started, a couple of friends from Georgia Tech early on. He paused. Emma, obviously. She's grown up watching it. She must think you're extraordinary, Evelyn said. Mason made a sound. Not quite a laugh, but in that vicinity. She thinks I spend too long in the garage, he said. She's probably right. But Evelyn caught something in his expression when he said his daughter's name. A particular softness that didn't match the controlled steadiness he maintained for everything else. This was the one thing he hadn't taught himself to keep at a measured distance. The one thing that got through. She thought about the 9-year-old girl at her grandmother's house right now. The one who came home on Friday afternoons to find her father in this garage, running calculations in handwritten notebooks by the light of shop lamps, building a machine that had no commercial value and no professional audience. Just one man finishing what his father started, with the only witness being a child who was growing up believing that the most normal thing in the world was for her father to make extraordinary things in the dark. Outside, a car passed slowly on Callaway Street. A dog barked somewhere down the block. The late afternoon light was starting to go orange at the garage door's edge. Evelyn picked up the envelope from the workbench. Mason watched her. She folded it in half and put it in her jacket pocket. "I'm not making any decisions right now," she said. "About anything." She looked at him steadily. "But I think I need to ask you some questions I should have asked a long time ago." He considered her for a moment with those level, unhurried eyes. "All right," he said. "Can I come back tomorrow?" He looked at the car, then at her. Something in his expression suggested he was running a calculation that had nothing to do with engineering. "Emma has soccer at 9, he said. "I'm usually back here by 11. 11, Evelyn repeated. "I'll be here." She started toward the garage door, then stopped, looked back at the car one more time, at the front wing with its precisely engineered cascade elements, at the cockpit's clean, purposeful interior, at the handwritten notebook still open on the floor beside where Mason had been crouching when she arrived. She thought about the letter she'd driven 40 minutes to deliver. She thought about how close she'd come to leaving this garage in 10 minutes with the thing done and the decision final, and this man and his notebook and his extraordinary, unfinished car tucked back into the category of talented mechanic, limited potential forever. "Mason," she said. He looked up. "The aerodynamic work on this car," she said. "It's genuinely extraordinary." He didn't say thank you. He didn't deflect it or diminish it. He just nodded once, the way a person nods when something true has been said, and picked up his torque wrench again. She walked back up the driveway to her car, sat inside for a moment without starting the engine, pulled out her phone, canceled the 3 o'clock Monday meeting with her VP of Operations, opened her calendar and blocked 11 a.m. Saturday with a single word: Callaway. Then she sat there for another minute in the quiet, thinking about a 9-year-old girl who thought her father's greatest gift was that he spent too much time in the garage, and who had no idea yet that she was wrong. Evelyn didn't sleep well that night. That wasn't unusual for her. She hadn't slept particularly well in about 6 years since the company hit its first serious crisis, and she'd learned that the kind of mind she had didn't know how to stop running when she laid it down in the dark. But this was different. This wasn't the familiar hum of unsolved business problems cycling through her head. This was something else, something that felt uncomfortably like guilt, which was an emotion Evelyn Sterling had very little practice sitting with. She lay in her apartment on the 23rd floor of a building she partially owned and stared at the ceiling and thought about cascade elements on a front wing aerodynamic assembly that had no business existing in a detached garage on Callaway Street. She thought about a torque wrench set carefully in its designated place on a workbench. She thought about a row of handwritten notebooks on a back shelf, 6 years of data recorded by hand because the man keeping the records had learned not to trust software assumptions about surface roughness on carbon sections. She thought about the envelope she'd driven 40 minutes to deliver, now sitting on her kitchen counter with a fold crease across the middle where she'd bent it in half before putting it in her pocket. At some point before 5 in the morning, she gave up on sleeping and made coffee and sat at her kitchen island with her laptop open. And she did what she always did when she didn't have enough information about something. She started looking. Mason Hale, Georgia Tech, 2016. The search took about 4 seconds to confirm everything he'd told her, and several things he hadn't bothered to mention. Academic records weren't public, but professional registries were, and engineering achievement databases were, and the motorsport industry had a surprisingly thorough digital memory. She found his name in an SAE technical paper from 2017, not as a co-author, as the primary author, on adaptive aerodynamic load management in open-wheel competition vehicles. She found a conference presentation from 2018, a technical symposium in Detroit, where Mason Hale of a mid-tier professional racing team had presented a suspension geometry optimization methodology that, from the abstract alone, was sophisticated enough that she read it 3 times to make sure she was understanding it correctly. She was. She found references to a chassis design he'd contributed to that had outperformed expectations at 2 consecutive endurance events in 2019. She found his name in the acknowledgments section of a doctoral dissertation on ground effect aerodynamics, written by someone at Michigan who had apparently consulted him while Mason was still in his mid-20s. And then, in the autumn of 2020, his name simply stopped appearing. No more papers, no more conference presentations, no more technical credits and race programs. Nothing. Like a signal that had been transmitting steadily and then, on a specific date, went dark. Evelyn sat with that for a while. She knew what had happened in 2020. He'd told her, or rather, he gestured at it in the way men like Mason gestured at painful things. Sideways, briefly, without ceremony. After losing his father, his career. Eventually, his marriage. She closed the laptop when the sky outside started going gray and sat with her coffee and thought about the specific shape of a loss like that. Not one thing taken, but 3. In close enough succession that they probably felt like one long unraveling. The father who'd been the compass. The career that had been built on the foundation the father represented. The marriage that apparently hadn't survived whatever version of Mason emerged from the other side of all of it. And then, a child. A 9-year-old with a bicycle with silver handlebar streamers and a grandmother she spent Friday afternoons with. The one thing that hadn't been taken. The one thing he'd organized his entire existence around. She was at Callaway Street at 5 minutes to 11. Mason's truck was in the driveway. She could see from the street that the garage door was already rolled up, and as she parked and walked up the driveway, she could hear him in there. Not the methodical metal sounds of the night before, but something quieter. She came around the side of the house and found him standing at the workbench with a mug of coffee, studying a technical drawing that was spread out and held flat at the corners by 2 wrenches, a small hydraulic fitting, and what appeared to be a child's soccer trophy. He looked up when she came in. His eyes went briefly to the envelope, which she was not carrying. "You came back," he said. "I said I would." "People say a lot of things." She looked at the soccer trophy holding down the corner of his drawing, tiny golden figure kicking a ball. The nameplate read, "Emma Hale, Most Improved, Spring Season." "How was soccer?" she asked. "She scored her first goal." He said it without any of the controlled steadiness he'd used for everything else the night before. It just came out, unguarded and warm, like he'd forgotten for a half-second who he was talking to. Then something in his expression recalibrated slightly. "She'll tell you about it if you're here long enough. She doesn't really have an off switch when it comes to soccer." "Is she here?" "Kitchen, making a sandwich, allegedly, probably also feeding half of it to the dog." "You have a dog." "Technically, Emma has a dog. I just pay for the vet bills and clean up after it." He picked up the technical drawing and rolled it carefully, set it aside. "She knows you're coming. I told her you work with me. She's been coached not to interrogate you." "Will that hold?" "Probably not for more than 10 minutes. There was, Evelyn noticed, a kind of ease to the way he talked about Emma that was entirely different from the measured, self-contained way he talked about everything else. Not just warmth, ease. Like his daughter was the one subject on which he had no defenses because he'd never built any, because it had never occurred to him that he needed them. She was still thinking about that when a door banged open at the side of the garage, and a 9-year-old with grass stains on both knees and a ponytail that had mostly escaped its elastic came through it carrying a sandwich on a paper plate with a dog, some kind of medium-sized brown disaster of a mutt, close behind her, nose up and working. Emma Hale assessed Evelyn with the absolute unself-consciousness of a child who had not yet learned to pretend she wasn't looking. "You're the lady from Dad's work," she said. "I am," Evelyn said. "I'm Evelyn." "I'm Emma. I scored a goal today." "I heard. Your dad told me." Emma looked at her father with an expression of mild betrayal. You already told her? She asked, Mason said. That's my news, Emma said, but without real heat. She climbed up onto a tall stool at the end of the workbench, clearly her stool, given how automatically she went to it, and set her sandwich on the bench and looked at Evelyn again with the frank appraisal of someone taking inventory. Dad says you're not the terminating person anymore. Mason closed his eyes very briefly. I said possibly. You said probably. I said we're still figuring things out. That's what grown-ups say when they mean probably, Emma told Evelyn confidentially. Evelyn looked at Mason. She's not wrong, she said. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close enough. Emma ate half her sandwich and let the dog have the rest in a move of practiced stealth that completely failed to deceive either adult in the room, then slid off her stool and wandered back toward the house with the dog at her heels, apparently satisfied that the new adult in her father's garage had been evaluated and provisionally cleared. The door banged shut behind her. She's something, Evelyn said. Yeah, Mason said. Simple. Like something didn't quite cover it, but he was used to words coming up short. Evelyn turned to the car. In the daylight, even the garage's filtered daylight, it looked different than it had the evening before. Not less impressive. More. The proportions were cleaner than she'd registered initially. The attention to detail in the bodywork was, the longer she looked at it, almost aggressive in its precision. This wasn't a man who'd gotten lucky with some of it. This was someone who had specific standards and had refused to let the fact of being alone in a garage on a limited budget lower them. I looked you up last night, she said. Mason was quiet behind her. The SAE paper from 2017, she said. The Detroit Symposium, the endurance program in 2019. She turned around. You were good. I was doing fine, he said. The correction was mild but deliberate. Good apparently wasn't a word he wanted applied to his own past without some resistance. The chassis worked that season, she said. The technical director at that team, I know him, Marcus Brielle. He told me once, at an industry dinner about 3 years ago, that the best suspension engineer he'd ever worked with had walked away from the sport before he was 30, and he still didn't fully understand why. She watched Mason's face. I didn't ask who he was talking about. I wish I had. Mason looked at the car for a moment, then at the workbench, then back at her, and she could see him deciding something. Not whether to tell her, she thought, but how much of it to tell. My dad had a stroke in October of 2020, he said. He was 61. He'd been building this, he gestured at the car, for about 2 years by then. He'd called me in September, a month before it happened, and asked me to come out and look at something he was stuck on, a rear diffuser problem he couldn't resolve. I told him I'd come out the following weekend. He stopped, picked up a shop rag and turned it over in his hands without doing anything with it. I didn't make it out that weekend. We were in the middle of a build cycle and I pushed it to the weekend after. He had the stroke on a Tuesday. The garage was very quiet. He survived, Mason said, but not in a way that let him work anymore. His hands were... The fine motor control was gone. He could tell you exactly what was wrong with the diffuser. He could describe the solution in detail. He just couldn't hold a wrench steady enough to do anything about it. How long did he live after the stroke? 8 months. He died in June of 2021. Mason set the shop rag down. I'd moved in by then to help take care of him. Lisa, Emma's mother, she was... He trailed off, seemed to reconsider whatever he was about to say, and chose a different, shorter path. She didn't handle the year well. Neither of us did. We handled it differently, which turned out to be worse than both of us handling it badly in the same direction. Evelyn said nothing. She understood, in a way she didn't want to examine too closely, exactly what he meant. Grief that pulls two people apart instead of together because they're grieving on different schedules, in different registers, and neither of them can find the other one when they need them. After Dad died, I left the team, Mason said. It wasn't a decision I made so much as one I woke up to having made. I just stopped going. I sat in this garage for about 6 weeks and started trying to figure out what he'd been trying to do with this car. He looked at it. Emma was 3. Lisa left about 4 months after that. It It wasn't a bad person situation. She was just done. And I understood that. And we worked out the custody arrangement, and she moved back to Portland, and that was the shape of things. So it's been you and Emma since she was 3, Evelyn said. Since she was 3. 6 years. The same 6 years the car had been sitting in this garage, growing incrementally toward completion in the hours between when a 9-year-old fell asleep and when her father allowed himself to rest. Mason, Evelyn said, can I ask you something direct? You've been doing that since you walked in last night. Fair. She looked at him steadily. Did you stay out of engineering because of the grief, or because of Emma, or because of something else? He thought about it. She appreciated that he didn't just reach for the nearest available answer. Both, he said. And also, he stopped, started again. When you're in professional motorsport, you're not just employed, you're absorbed. The hours, the travel, the build cycles. You're there or you're not. There's no middle gear. Emma needed consistency more than she needed a father who was technically present, but actually living in a fabrication facility 3 states away. The mechanic job gave me something the engineering career never could. I was home every night, same time. I knew what she was having for dinner. But you never stopped doing engineering work, Evelyn said, gesturing at the car. No, I just stopped getting paid for it. He said it without irony or resentment, as pure fact. She walked slowly along the side of the car, running her eyes over it without touching. When she reached the rear section, she crouched down and looked at the diffuser. The same feature his father had called him about, the one Mason hadn't come out that weekend to help with. It was resolved now. Clearly, decisively resolved, with an elegance that made her feel slightly inadequate about her own aerodynamic knowledge. Is this the solution? She asked. The rear diffuser. Is this what he called you about? Mason came and crouched beside her. He looked at it for a moment. Close to, he said. The solution he had in mind was more complicated. This is a different approach, same performance outcome, different path to get there. He pointed to where the diffuser's strakes intersected with the floor's outermost channel. He was trying to solve it with geometry. I ended up solving it with surface finish and inlet conditioning instead. He would have had opinions about that. Good opinions or bad ones? Loud ones, Mason said, and this time the thing at the corner of his mouth became an actual, brief, slightly sad smile. He had strong feelings about diffuser geometry. He would have wanted to argue about this for at least 2 hours before he admitted it worked. Evelyn sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was still looking at the diffuser with an expression that had complicated things in it. Satisfaction and something unresolvable underneath it, like a sum that kept coming out right, but felt wrong for reasons that had nothing to do with the math. He would have been proud of this, she said. Maybe, Mason said. He also would have found 3 things wrong with the rear wing angle and made me defend every decision I made on the undertray. He stood up, which would have been the right thing to do. They spent the next 2 hours in the garage. Evelyn had not planned to stay 2 hours. She had brought a notebook, a professional habit she couldn't break, and somewhere in the first 40 minutes, she found herself taking actual notes, not the polite kind that executives take in meetings to signal engagement, but real ones, technical ones. Questions that sent her reaching back into engineering knowledge she hadn't actively used in nearly a decade. Mason answered every question without impatience, without condescension, without the faint note of, "Let me simplify this for you," that she'd encountered more times than she could count, from men who knew less than he did. He talked about the car the way someone talks about something they've lived inside of for years. Not a presentation, just a description, layered with details he'd forgotten he knew until the question surfaced them. Emma came back to the garage twice. The first time to get a box of cereal she'd apparently stored on the bottom shelf of the workbench in defiance of all reasonable food storage conventions, and the second time to show her father a text from her teammate about the goal, which Mason read, responded to with an appropriate level of enthusiasm, and handed back. The second visit she lingered, eating dry cereal out of the box and watching the adults with the patient, assessing attention of a child who had spent years being the only other person in a room while the grown-up in her life worked on something large and complicated. "Do you understand all of it?" Evelyn asked her, at a moment when the conversation had paused. "The car," I mean, all the technical parts. Emma considered this. I understand more than Dad thinks I do, she said. He explains stuff when I ask. I ask a lot. What do you know about the rear diffuser? Emma looked at the back of the car. It manages the airflow under the car, so it creates negative pressure that sucks the car down onto the track instead of lifting it up. Dad changed the way it's shaped from what Grandpa Frank had drawn, because his way was going to make something called boundary layer separation worse at low speeds, and you don't want that. Evelyn looked at Mason. I ask a lot, Emma repeated, and went back to her cereal. It was around 1 in the afternoon, when Evelyn had been there for 2 hours, and Mason had made a second round of coffee that was too strong, but she drank it anyway, that Emma came back into the garage for a third time carrying a piece of paper. Not casually, with a deliberateness that meant the paper was the reason for the visit. Dad, she said, I forgot to show you. Mrs. Okafor sent it home Friday. Mason took it. Evelyn watched his face as he read it. He was still for a moment in a way that was different from his usual stillness. This was the stillness of something catching him off guard. What is it? Evelyn asked. He handed it to her without speaking. It was a letter from Emma's school on district letterhead, a writing competition, regional, grades 3 through 5, theme of someone who inspires me. Emma Hale, 4th grade, had placed first in her grade and was being recognized at the district awards ceremony in 2 weeks. Attached was a printed copy of the essay itself. Evelyn read it. It was 9 years old, and it read like 9 years old. The sentences were sometimes run-on, the spelling in a couple places was creative, but it didn't read like most 9-year-old writing, which tended toward the general and the performed. This was specific. This was observed. Emma had written about her father's car not as a magical object, but as a long project, a patient thing, something she had watched accumulate over the course of her entire conscious life. She described the notebooks. She described the way her father checked and rechecked calculations that he'd already checked. She described the night he had figured out the diffuser problem. She'd been in her pajamas watching from the garage door because she'd heard him swear, which was rare, and gone to check if he was okay, and found him sitting on the floor next to the car with a notebook in his lap, looking like someone who had just found something they'd lost a very long time ago. She wrote about her grandfather she'd never met, pieced together from the photographs on the workshop wall and the stories her father told without realizing he was telling them. She wrote that her father was finishing her grandfather's dream and that she thought that was the best thing a person could do for someone they loved, which was finish what they started when they couldn't finish it themselves. The last line of the essay was, my dad works on it every night after I go to sleep, and I think he doesn't know that I know that, but I do. Evelyn lowered the paper. Emma was watching her father, not Evelyn. Mason was looking at the side of the car, at nothing specific on it, just at the car, with the expression of a man who has been quietly seen by someone he thought he was protecting from seeing him too clearly, and who doesn't know what to do with being found out by someone he loves. Emma, he said, without turning around. His voice was even. Yeah? When did you write this? 3 weeks ago, for the competition. A pause. Are you mad? He turned around then. No, he said. I'm not mad. I didn't say anything private, Emma said, which was her 9-year-old version of a legal defense. It was all things I saw myself. That's different. It is different, Mason agreed. Mrs. Okafor said it was the best essay she's read in 4 years of teaching. Did she? She cried a little. Mason said nothing for a moment. Then he crossed the garage and took the paper back gently from Evelyn's hands and looked at it for a few seconds and then folded it carefully. Not quickly, not dismissively, but with the particular care of someone preserving something, and put it in the breast pocket of his work shirt. You should be proud, Evelyn said to Emma. I am, Emma said simply, the way 9-year-olds state things they are completely sure of. What she couldn't see, what only Evelyn, standing at the right angle, could see, was that Mason reached up for a half second and pressed his hand flat against the outside of his breast pocket over the folded essay, in a gesture so brief and private that it was gone before it had properly existed. Evelyn looked away. She looked at the car. She looked at the row of notebooks on the back shelf. She looked at the photographs she hadn't properly examined before, pinned to the wall above the workbench, a constellation of them. A man she recognized as an older version of Mason's face, heavily built, white-haired, standing in front of race cars in various states of completion across what looked like decades. The same man crouching next to a young kid, maybe 10, 11, beside what might have been an early iteration of the same chassis that was now in this garage. The same man, later, older, accepting what appeared to be some kind of technical award at a professional event. Frank Hale, engineer, father, the man who started this. And then, in one photograph near the end of the row, the white-haired man and a much younger Mason standing side by side in this exact garage. Early days of the build, both of them looking at the bare chassis with expressions so similar that Evelyn felt the shared gene running between them, like a visible thread. She thought about what Emma had written. The best thing a person can do for someone they loved is finish what they started when they couldn't finish it themselves. 9 years old and already more right about things than most adults. Evelyn picked up her notebook and her pen, both of which she'd set on the workbench while she read the essay, and turned to face Mason. "I need to be honest with you about something," she said. He looked at her with that quiet, assessing attention. "The restructuring isn't the only reason I came out here Friday," she said. "I have a position I'm trying to fill. Head of Advanced Engineering and Vehicle Dynamics, Sterling Dynamics. It's a new role. I created it 8 months ago, and I've gone through 3 interview processes without finding the right person." She paused. "I wasn't thinking of you for it when I drove out here, because I didn't know to think of you for it. That was my failure, not yours. But I'm thinking of you for it now." Mason was quiet. "I want you to think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking right now, not a decision. Just don't rule it out before we've had a real conversation." He was still looking at her, and in the particular quality of that look she read something she hadn't expected. Not wariness, not skepticism, but something more considered than either, like he was measuring the distance between where she was standing and where he stood, and doing the calculation honestly rather than hopefully. "My daughter gets out of school at 3:30, he said. "I know. That doesn't change. I didn't ask it to." He looked at the car again, the last half-dozen feet of it that weren't quite finished, the rear wing assembly that still needed its final fitment, the aerodynamic elements that were sitting on the workbench waiting to be mounted, the engine cover that was leaning against the back wall because its attachment hardware hadn't been sourced yet. So close. Months, maybe, from something that had taken 6 years to get this far. "Think about it," Evelyn said again. She picked up her jacket from where she'd draped it over the stool that was Emma's stool, and she walked to the garage door. Behind her, Mason didn't say anything. She hadn't expected him to. She was beginning to understand that Mason Hale operated on his own timeline, that the appearance of stillness in him was actually just thought moving at a different speed than it moved in most people. Slower on the surface, more thorough underneath. She was at the end of the driveway when his voice came from the garage. "Evelyn?" She turned. He was standing just inside the door, hands in his pockets, the afternoon light doing complicated things to the shadows in the garage behind him. "The position you created," he said, "what did you build it around?" "Someone who could lead an engineering team that had stopped believing in its own work," she said. "Someone who understood the difference between technical competence and technical vision. Someone who had built things that mattered outside of a professional context, because that's the only way to know if someone actually loves the work or just loves the career." She held his gaze. "I built it around someone I hadn't met yet." He looked at her for a moment without expression. Then he nodded once, the same nod he'd given when she'd called his aerodynamic work extraordinary, the one that meant a true thing has been said and nothing more. She drove home thinking about the essay folded in the breast pocket of a mechanic's work shirt, and about a 9-year-old girl who had been watching her father build something extraordinary in the dark, and had written it down before anyone thought to ask her what she'd seen. The district awards ceremony was held on a Tuesday evening in the gymnasium of Westfield Elementary, which had been decorated for the occasion with the kind of enthusiasm that only volunteer parent committees and a modest supply budget could produce. Paper banners in school colors, rows of folding chairs arranged with military precision, a podium borrowed from the auditorium that was slightly too tall for the principal presenting from it. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that made the room feel simultaneously festive and slightly exhausted, which was, Mason thought, a pretty accurate description of most school events. He sat in the third row with Emma beside him, dressed in the blue dress she had selected herself, and then second-guessed twice on the drive over, and Emma's grandmother, his mother, Carol, a compact 60-year-old woman with strong opinions and comfortable shoes, on Emma's other side. Carol had driven in from 40 minutes away when Mason called to tell her about the essay and the award, and she had spent the first 10 minutes after arriving at the house reading the printed copy of Emma's writing at the kitchen table with a very specific expression on her face that Mason recognized from childhood as the one she wore when she was working hard not to cry in front of people. "She's a writer," Carol had said, handing the essay back. "She's 9, Mason said. "I know how old she is. She's also a writer." He hadn't argued. It was easier not to argue with his mother about things she was right about. The ceremony moved through its recognitions in the methodical way of school events: science fair, mathematics, citizenship, attendance, the various hierarchies of academic merit that schools produced and parents photographed. Emma sat with the stillness of someone managing genuine nerves, which she was better at than most adults Mason knew, and he sat beside her with his hands on his knees and watched her manage them, and felt, as he often did in these moments, the particular and slightly unsteady pride of a parent watching their child navigate the world without them. He had not told Emma that he'd invited Evelyn. He wasn't sure why he'd done it. He'd mentioned the ceremony in passing during one of the 3 follow-up conversations he and Evelyn had conducted over the previous 2 weeks, phone calls mostly, and one meeting at Sterling Dynamics' downtown office that Mason had arrived to in clean jeans and a collared shirt, and which had run 2 hours longer than scheduled because they'd started talking about the engineering division's current project backlog, and neither of them had noticed the time moving. He'd mentioned the ceremony the way you mention things to someone you've been talking to regularly without calculating the mention in advance. She'd asked for the date and time. He'd given them to her. He'd mostly assumed she wouldn't come, on the grounds that billionaire CEOs had more pressing Tuesday evening obligations than elementary school gymnasiums. He saw her come in about 7 minutes before the ceremony started. She was near the back, finding a seat in the last row, dressed in a way that was clearly her version of dressed down. Dark trousers, a simple jacket, no jewelry except small earrings. She'd made an effort not to stand out, which was the kind of thing someone did when they understood that this wasn't their event, and they didn't want it to become about them. Mason noticed that. He also noticed that she spotted him in the third row, and he gave her a brief nod, and she nodded back, and neither of them made anything of it. Emma's name was called 12 minutes into the ceremony. She walked to the podium with the careful, deliberate steps of someone who had decided in advance exactly how they were going to make this walk, and accepted her certificate and ribbon from the principal. And when the principal asked if she'd like to read a portion of her essay, Emma said yes in a voice that was steady and clear and carried to the back of the gymnasium without the microphone she'd been offered. She read 4 paragraphs. The one about the notebooks. The one about the grandfather she'd never met. The one about the night her father found the solution to the problem that had beaten him for months, and she'd heard him swear and come to check on him in her pajamas. And the last one, about finishing what someone started when they couldn't finish it themselves. The gymnasium was very quiet by the end. Not the performed quiet of an audience being respectful, the actual quiet of a room full of people who have stopped thinking about their own lives for a moment. Carol put her hand on Mason's arm without looking at him. He didn't say anything. He clapped when Emma finished with everyone else and watched his daughter walk back to her seat with the same careful, deliberate steps. And when Emma sat down, she leaned sideways into his arm briefly. Not a hug, just a lean, a quick check-in, and then straightened up and looked at the podium again with the expression of someone who had done a hard thing and was satisfied with how it went. Mason looked down at the certificate in Emma's lap, looked at his daughter's name printed on it, thought about the essay folded in his work shirt 2 weeks ago, still sitting on his dresser at home because he hadn't figured out where to put it, which meant he'd been carrying it from room to room in his head instead. After the ceremony, there was the predictable cluster in the gymnasium lobby. Photographs, congratulations from other parents, Emma's teacher, Mrs. Okafor, a brisk and warm-hearted woman who grabbed Mason's hand with both of hers and said, "I hope you know what you have in this girl," and moved on before he could respond to it, which was probably for the best. He was talking to another parent near the water fountain when he felt, rather than saw, Evelyn stop beside him. The other parent finished what he was saying and drifted away, and Mason turned. "You came," he said. "I said I would," Evelyn said, which was exactly what he'd said to her 2 weeks ago on Calloway Street, and the echo of it landed between them with a precision that was probably not accidental. "She was wonderful," Evelyn said. "Not she did great or what a performance. Wonderful," which was the right word and more honest than the alternatives. "Yeah," Mason said. "The part about the night you found the diffuser solution." "I know." "You didn't know she was watching." "I didn't know she was watching," he confirmed. Before either of them could say anything else, Emma materialized between them in the way children materialize, without apparent transit, simply absent and then present, holding her certificate and looking at Evelyn with the same frank, unself-conscious appraisal she'd deployed in the garage 2 weeks earlier. "You came to my thing," Emma said. "I did," Evelyn said. "You were remarkable." "My dad's face went weird when I read the pajama part," Emma said. "My face didn't go weird," Mason said. "It went a little weird," Carol said, appearing from somewhere to Mason's left. She was carrying a paper cup of the gymnasium's terrible coffee with the stoic expression of a woman who had committed to the beverage and would see it through. She looked at Evelyn with forthright curiosity. "You must be the Sterling Dynamics person." "Carol," Mason said. "I'm just noting," Carol said. "Evelyn Sterling. I looked you up." She extended her free hand. "Carol Hale. I'm the one who taught this one to actually finish the things he started, so in some indirect way this evening is my doing as well." Evelyn shook her hand. "I can believe that," she said. Carol looked at her son with an expression that said several things simultaneously without being so rude as to say any of them out loud, and then steered Emma toward the cookies table, which Emma had been eyeing since the lobby opened, and left Mason and Evelyn standing near the water fountain in something that might have been called privacy, relative to a gymnasium lobby. "Your mother is terrifying," Evelyn said. "She's an acquired taste," Mason said. "You pass muster, for what it's worth. She didn't ask you about your intentions." "What does that look like when she does?" "More direct than what you just experienced," Mason said. "How are you with eye contact?" Evelyn almost smiled. "Professionally or personally?" "She doesn't make that distinction." There was a comfortable few seconds of nothing, which was something Mason had noticed about the conversations with Evelyn over the past 2 weeks. That the silences in them had stopped being assessments and started being just silences, the kind that existed between people who had agreed without discussing it, that they didn't need to fill every gap. "I had a board meeting today," Evelyn said. "How'd it go?" "I told them I was restructuring the search for the head of engineering position, that I was withdrawing the current offer to the candidate we'd selected and reopening the process." She looked at him. 3 of the 5 board members asked me to reconsider. They want someone with current corporate credentials, someone whose recent experience is in an executive context. "That's a reasonable position," Mason said. "It's a short-sighted one," Evelyn said, "which is what I told them." "How did that land?" "The way it usually lands when I tell the board they're being short-sighted." She shrugged once. "They'll come around when they see the work. They always do." Mason looked across the lobby to where Emma was negotiating with Carol about the maximum socially acceptable number of cookies for a 4th grader at a school event. Emma was making her case with hand gestures. Carol was holding firm with the expression of someone who had negotiated with this particular opponent for 9 years and had no illusions about the difficulty of the task. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said. "The position." Evelyn waited. "I have conditions," Mason said. "Not salary, not the obvious stuff, actual conditions about how the role works." "Tell me." He turned to face her more directly. "The engineering team at Sterling Dynamics. I've looked at your current output, patent filings, development timelines, what's been presented at industry conferences. The work is competent. It's not visionary. You've got people who are technically capable and creatively stuck, which means somewhere in the last few years the culture started rewarding not being wrong over being interesting." He said it without diplomacy, but also without cruelty, the way he talked about engineering problems. as a diagnosis, not an accusation. You fix that from the inside or you don't fix it. And you don't fix it by bringing in an executive who manages the team from above. You fix it by putting someone in there who works beside them. That's what I want, Evelyn said. Then I need the authority to actually do it. Not approval processes for every design decision. Not quarterly presentations to a committee. I need to be able to greenlight work, kill work, redirect resources, and bring in outside consultants without running it up a chain. He met her eyes. I've worked in environments where engineers had to fight the organizational structure to do good work. That's not where I'm willing to go back to. Agreed, Evelyn said. Not, I'll see what I can do. Not let me discuss that with the board, just agreed. And mentorship, Mason said. Formal, structured, with protected time. Junior engineers paired with senior ones, not as a side project, but as an evaluated part of the program. My father ran it that way. It's the only model I've seen that actually works long term. I'll build it into the department structure, Evelyn said. You designed the program. He looked at her for a moment. Something in the quality of her agreement, the speed of it, the specificity, told him she'd already thought about most of this. That she wasn't conceding ground, she was confirming overlap. You designed this role around someone you hadn't met, he said. Yes. You'd already thought about most of what I just said. Most of it. She held his gaze steadily. Not the mentorship component, specifically. That's yours. But the rest? Yes. I built this role around someone I was looking for. I looked in the wrong places for 8 months. She paused. I drove to a mechanic's house to hand him a termination letter. The words sat there between them for a moment. Mason let it. Why didn't you tell anyone? Evelyn asked. At the facility. Your qualifications. Any of it. He considered it. The facility manager knew I had an engineering background. It was on my original application. He didn't ask questions beyond that, and I didn't offer answers. He looked at the water fountain, then back at her. When you've spent enough time in environments where people have already decided what you are, you stop explaining yourself. It doesn't usually change anything, and after a while, he stopped, reached for the right words. After a while, you stop needing it to. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful in a way that it hadn't been before. When I came into your garage the first time, she said, with the letter, I had already decided what I was walking into, before I knocked on the door. I know, Mason said. I don't usually do that. I think you do it more than you know, he said. Not harshly, just honestly. Most people do. The job title is the loudest piece of information in the room. Evelyn looked down at the paper cup she was holding. She'd picked up coffee at some point, probably out of social habit, and hadn't drunk any of it. You never corrected me, she said. The whole first evening, when I called you a talented mechanic with limited potential. I didn't say that in those words, but that's what the letter said. And you know it. You let me stand there and deliver it. You didn't ask, Mason said. The 4 words landed in the gymnasium lobby the way they would later land in Evelyn Sterling's memory, with the blunt, quiet weight of a thing that was simple and devastating at the same time. Not an accusation, not a performance of injured dignity, just the cleanest possible statement of what had happened. She had walked into his garage with a conclusion already written, and she had not asked. Evelyn was not a person who flinched. She'd built a company from 40 employees to 400 and navigated 3 hostile market corrections, and fired people she liked, and hired people who turned out to be wrong and made decisions that cost her sleep, and made decisions she'd had to publicly walk back, which cost her more than sleep. She did not flinch. She came very close to it now. You're right, she said. I know, Mason said, not unkindly. I judged you by your job. Yes. And I didn't ask a single question that would have... No. She stopped, took a breath that was slightly less controlled than her normal breathing. I'm sorry, Mason. Not professionally sorry. Actually, sorry. He looked at her for a moment with those level-assessing eyes. Then he nodded, not the quick dismissive nod of someone accepting an apology to move past it, but the slower one she'd seen him give before, the one that meant he was weighing something and the weight had come out right. I know, he said. Across the lobby, Emma won the cookie negotiation. 3, apparently, was the number Carol had landed on, and looked over to find her father and beamed at him with chocolate on her lower lip, which she was unaware of. Mason raised his eyebrows at her. She raised her eyebrows back in a mirror of exactly the same expression, which made Carol say something that was too far away to hear, but clearly fell somewhere between exasperated and fond. "She does that thing with her eyebrows," Evelyn observed. "She's had a good teacher," Mason said. They stood together for another minute in the lobby noise, two people who had begun something in a garage 12 days ago that neither of them had a clear name for yet. Not friendship exactly, not purely professional, something that was still finding its dimensions. The following Monday morning, Evelyn withdrew the offer Sterling Dynamics had extended to its previous engineering candidate, a man with an MBA, 15 years in corporate technical leadership, and a portfolio of competent, safe, unremarkable work, with a brief and professional phone call that the man received with the wounded dignity of someone who had already mentally redecorated the office. She then called a meeting with her board, all 5 members, in the glass conference room on the 27th floor. She laid it out directly. She told them about Mason Hale's educational background, his professional history, the SAE paper, and the conference presentations, and the chassis work, and the 6 years of independent engineering work in a home garage that produced something that had no right to exist at that level of quality outside of a professional facility. She showed them photographs she'd taken of the car on her second visit to Callaway Street, with Mason's permission grudgingly given. She put his resume, newly updated at her request, on the table in front of each of them. The board was quiet for longer than boards usually were. Richard Amara, the eldest member and the one who'd pushed hardest for the conventional candidate, looked at the photographs for a long time. Then he looked at Evelyn. "How did we not know about this person?" he said. "Because he was working as a mechanic at one of our regional facilities," Evelyn said, "and no one thought to look harder." "Including you," Richard said. "Including me," Evelyn said. "For approximately 11 months, until last Friday." Another silence. "He's been out of the professional engineering world for 4 years," said Patricia Cho, the board's youngest member and generally its most precise thinker. "That's not nothing, Evelyn. The technology landscape in advanced vehicle dynamics has moved considerably in 4 years." "It has," Evelyn agreed, "but he's been doing engineering work for 4 years regardless, just not in a corporate context." She paused. "The rear diffuser solution on that car represents a boundary layer management approach that our current team has not arrived at, despite 2 years of working on a nearly identical problem in our GT class development program." Patricia looked at the photograph. "He solved a problem we haven't solved," Evelyn said, "in a home garage, without a budget, without a team, and without anyone asking him to." She let that sit. "I don't want to know what we're leaving on the table if we pass on this." The vote to authorize the revised hire was 4-1. Richard Amara was the one. He voted against it with the formal gravity of a man who believed in registering dissent clearly, then shook Evelyn's hand afterward in the hallway and said, "I hope you're right about him," which from Richard was a form of blessing even when it didn't sound like one. She told Mason about the board meeting that afternoon by phone. He listened without interrupting, which was standard for him, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Patricia Cho's question," he said, "about being out of the professional space for 4 years." "Yes." "She's not wrong to ask it." "I know. The answer is the diffuser solution. The answer is also that I'm aware of what I've missed," he said. "I've been reading. I don't have the institutional knowledge of someone who was in the room for the last 4 years, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." He paused. "I'd want a month before taking any significant technical leadership position. Time to properly review where your programs are, talk to the actual engineers doing the work, understand the real problems versus the reported problems." "Those are often different things," Evelyn said. "They're almost always different things." She made a note in her notebook. "A month. What does that look like structurally?" "Unpaid if you need it to be." "I'm not interested in negotiating from that position. I just need the access and the time." "It won't be unpaid," she said flatly. "Evelyn, it won't be unpaid," she repeated, and that was the end of that. She could hear him breathing on the other end of the phone. Not frustrated breathing, more the breathing of someone deciding whether an argument is worth the effort and concluding it isn't. "Fine," he said. "Good." Another pause. Then Mason said, "The ceremony last night, Emma wanted me to tell you she was glad you came." "I was glad I came," Evelyn said. "Tell her I thought her essay was the best piece of writing I've read in a long time." "She'll take that to school," Mason warned. "She should." "She'll tell everyone a CEO said it." "She can tell everyone a CEO said it," Evelyn said. "It's true." Mason was quiet again, and in the texture of the quiet, Evelyn could hear something. Not contentment exactly, but the absence of attention that had been present in every previous silence between them. Like something that had been holding itself at a particular distance had decided the distance was no longer necessary. "Mason," she said. "Yeah." "When you come in, to meet the team." She chose her next words carefully. "I want you to know I'm not going to stand in that room and give a speech about your qualifications or your background. I'm not going to explain you to them. They're going to figure out what you are the same way I did." She paused. "By watching you work." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the right call," he said. "I know," she said, and heard distantly the slight hitch of something almost like a laugh from his end of the line, brief, genuine, and gone before it had fully arrived. She hung up and sat in her office on the 27th floor and looked out the window at the city arranging itself in the afternoon light below her, and thought about a 4-word sentence delivered in a garage on Calloway Street with no heat and no theater behind it. You never asked. She had been running Sterling Dynamics for 6 years. She had hired 400 people. She had believed, with the quiet confidence of someone who was very good at most things, that she knew how to assess a person, how to look at available information and arrive at an accurate conclusion. What Mason Hale had done, not deliberately, not strategically, just by answering what was asked and not volunteering what wasn't, was show her a gap in her own methodology that was significant enough to be uncomfortable. She had optimized her hiring process for credentials and presentation. She had built very good filters, and those filters had worked perfectly, in the sense that they had successfully excluded Mason Hale from her consideration for 11 months, while she ran 3 interview processes searching for something she'd already had. The question that had been sitting in the back of her mind since she'd walked out of the garage that first Friday, the one she'd been too busy and too proud to look at directly, was simply, how many others? How many other people had she walked past with a conclusion already formed, a job title reading as the final word, a question she hadn't thought to ask because she'd already decided she didn't need the answer? She didn't have a number. She suspected she didn't want one. What she had was a month with a man who had spent 4 years being underestimated by an institution she ran, doing extraordinary work in the hours after his daughter went to sleep, keeping records in notebooks by hand because he didn't trust the software's assumptions, finishing something his father hadn't been able to finish. Not for recognition, not for money, not for anyone watching. Just because it was the right thing to do, and because no one who genuinely loved the work could leave it unfinished. She looked out the window for another minute. Then she opened her notebook to a fresh page, wrote mentorship program, structure at the top, and started working. Mason showed up to Sterling Dynamics on a Monday morning in the second week of October with a travel mug of coffee and no briefcase, which caused a minor bureaucratic disruption at the front desk because the security system expected new executives to arrive with the full ceremonial weight of their position. Laptop bag, portfolio, the physical accessories of corporate authority. Mason had his notebook, the same kind he used in the garage, a black hardcover composition book, slightly worn at the corners. The security guard, a young man named Derek who had been doing this job for 3 years and had processed the arrivals of 17 executives in that time, looked at the notebook and then at Mason and then at his screen and said, "Head of Advanced Engineering and Vehicle Dynamics?" with the particular tone of someone reading a title that didn't match the person in front of them. "That's me," Mason said. Derek printed the badge. Mason clipped it to his shirt pocket, picked up his coffee, and went upstairs. Evelyn had arranged for him to have the first week without formal introduction. No all-hands announcement, no department-wide email from the CEO welcoming the new executive. just a workspace on the engineering floor, a desk at the edge of the open plan area, positioned where he could see most of the room, and access to every file, every active project, every development timeline and testing report and internal technical document Sterling Dynamics Engineering Division had produced in the last 3 years. She had given the team a brief, neutral heads up. A new senior engineer would be joining the floor to review current programs. Nothing more. It was Mason's idea. Evelyn had initially pushed for a proper introduction. She believed in clarity of structure and thought her team deserved to know who they were reporting to. Mason had been patient but firm. "I want to see how they work before they know they're being watched," he'd said, "not to evaluate them unfairly. Because the first week after a new boss is announced, everyone performs a version of themselves. I don't want the performance. I want the actual thing." She'd conceded. She was finding, with some consistency, that his instincts about people were worth conceding to. The engineering floor at Sterling Dynamics occupied the entirety of the 19th floor, a large open workspace with drafting stations, several CAD terminals, a materials testing area partitioned off by glass walls at the far end, and a culture that Mason clocked within approximately 40 minutes of sitting down. Not from the work itself, not yet, but from the small tells. The way people moved between stations, too much checking of whether others were watching before they committed to a decision. The length of time it took for someone to speak up in the informal stand-up meeting that happened at 9:15, a full 90 seconds of silence before anyone ventured an opinion, and the opinion ventured was carefully hedged. The fact that the whiteboard at the center of the room, which was clearly meant to be a working ideas space, had one diagram on it that looked like it had been there for several weeks without anyone touching it. Not a bad team. A careful one. A team that had learned, in some accumulated way that no single person had probably chosen, that being wrong was worse than being quiet. He recognized it immediately. He'd felt it himself in earlier jobs, that slow institutional gravity that pulled good engineers towards safe choices, that made the risk of a failed idea feel more real than the cost of never trying it. He understood exactly how it happened and how long it could take to undo it, and he sat at his desk on the first morning and drank his coffee and watched and made notes, and did not say anything that he wasn't asked directly. By Wednesday of the first week, 2 of the engineers had started talking to him. Not because he'd introduced himself at length or made himself available in a conspicuous way, because he'd looked at the diagram on the whiteboard and asked, genuinely, what the problem with it was. The diagram belonged to a 27-year-old engineer named Theo Marsh, who had apparently put it up 3 weeks ago as part of a proposal for a revised cooling system architecture and had received no substantive response from the previous engineering management in that time. Theo had told him this with the careful neutrality of someone who had stopped expecting things to be different. "What was the objection?" Mason asked. "There wasn't one, officially," Theo said. "It just kind of—" he made a gesture. "Didn't go anywhere." Mason looked at the diagram for about 2 minutes. "The inlet geometry on the primary duct," he said. "Your flow modeling. Did you run this at operating temperature or ambient?" Theo blinked. "Ambient. The simulation software defaults to—" "Yeah. The defaults are wrong for this application. Your numbers are probably conservative by about 12%. He pointed to the duct junction. "Which means this looks marginal on paper, but at operating conditions it's likely fine." He stepped back from the board. "Have you got the simulation file?" Theo had the simulation file. They spent 90 minutes at a CAD terminal rerunning the model with corrected temperature inputs, and by the end of it, the proposal that had been sitting on the whiteboard for 3 weeks was not only confirmed viable, but stronger than its author had believed. Theo was quiet for a moment, looking at the revised outputs, and then he said, "So the whole time it was just the default setting," with an expression that was some mixture of relieved and furious. "The defaults are almost always wrong for edge cases," Mason said. "That's not a failure in your work. That's a gap in the process for checking assumptions." A woman named Kara Liu, who was 31 and had been at Sterling Dynamics for 4 years and was, Mason quickly understood, among the sharpest technical minds on the floor, had been listening from her adjacent station with the lateral attention of someone who was interested but hadn't decided yet whether to show it. She looked over when Mason said gap in the process for checking assumptions. We don't really have a formal assumption validation step in the review process, she said. I know, Mason said. I've been reading your program documentation. And? He turned to look at her directly. She met his eyes without flinching, which told him something useful. Your documentation is very thorough, he said. It records what was decided extremely well. It almost never records why a different option was rejected. Kara looked at him for a moment. You're not just reviewing programs, are you? She said. It wasn't quite a question. No, Mason said. She looked at the whiteboard, at Theo's revised simulation outputs on the screen, then back at Mason with an expression that was cautious but not closed. Who are you exactly? He told her his name. Her eyes went to his badge, the title on it, and she went very still for a half-second in the way of someone recalibrating rapidly. You've been sitting over there since Monday, she said. Yes. Watching us. Mostly listening, he said. There's a difference. She thought about this. Did Ms. Sterling set this up? It was my preference, Mason said. She agreed to it. Kara looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. The whiteboard thing, Theo's proposal, is that going to move forward now? We're going to build a physical prototype of the duct assembly and run it through thermal testing before anything's formally approved, Mason said. But yes, it's going to move forward. Something in Kara's expression shifted. Not dramatically, not the movie version of someone's whole face transforming, just a small unlocking. Like a door that had been stuck moving a fraction of an inch, enough to suggest it could open all the way if you push steadily. Okay, she said, and turned back to her workstation. The formal introduction came at the beginning of week 2, when Mason called the team together at the center of the floor. Not in a conference room, not at a podium, just in the open workspace, and stood in front of 23 engineers of varying levels of seniority and told them who he was in about 4 minutes. His background, his history, what he'd been doing for the past 4 years, and why he was here. He didn't sell it, he just described it, with the same flat specificity he used to describe engineering solutions. He told them he'd spent the first week listening because he needed to understand what the actual work looked like before he started changing anything, and that everything he'd heard suggested a team that was technically capable and organizationally stuck, and that he intended to address the second problem in a way that would require some of them to be uncomfortable. I'm not interested in managing from above the work, he said. I'll be at the bench with you. I'll be in the reviews with you. I'll be asking questions that feel inconvenient, and I'd like you to ask them back. He looked around the room. If you have a proposal that went nowhere, bring it back. If you have an idea you haven't written down because it didn't seem worth the effort, write it down. He paused. And if you think I'm wrong about something, tell me directly. I don't need it softened. I need it accurate. Silence. The particular silence of a room that was deciding something. Then Theo Marsh, from the third row of the assembled group, said, What about the assumption validation step you mentioned? It goes into the review process starting with the next project cycle, Mason said. Kara's been working on a framework for it. You'll see a draft by Thursday. Kara, who had not known her name was about to be said in front of the entire department, looked up. There was a beat of something. Surprise, possibly. And then she straightened and nodded once, with the particular expression of someone who has been given a responsibility and has decided they're going to carry it without making a fuss about it. The meeting broke up after 12 minutes. Mason had been right, more or less. 12 minutes was what it took to say what needed saying without filling the remaining time with things that could be said with work instead. He called Evelyn that evening to give her a brief update, which was something she'd asked for, and which he'd agreed to with the caveat that the updates would be honest rather than optimistic. She had accepted that condition without argument. How'd the introduction go? She asked. Fine, he said. They're watchful. They're not convinced yet. That's appropriate. Did anyone push back? Not directly. Kara Lou asked me 2 hard questions after everyone else had left. About authority structure, specifically, who I report to versus who has override capability on project approvals. What did you tell her? The truth, Mason said, that I report to you and that you have ultimate authority, but that you've agreed not to exercise override on technical decisions without coming to me first, and that if that changes, I'll tell the team directly. A brief pause. You told her I'd agreed not to override you on technical decisions. Yes. That's a significant thing to tell a junior engineer about internal authority structure. She's not going to be junior for very long, Mason said. And it was true. I told her a true thing. He heard Evelyn take a controlled breath and almost heard the words she was choosing not to say. You can be annoyed with me about the transparency if you want, but a team that doesn't trust the structure they're working in won't take risks, and a team that doesn't take risks won't do interesting work. I know, Evelyn said. I'm not annoyed. A pause. I'm slightly annoyed. I know. I'll get over it. I know that too. She made a sound that was possibly a laugh, or possibly what a laugh sounded like when Evelyn Sterling was suppressing one. How's Theo's cooling proposal? Thermal testing starts Friday. Early numbers look good. And Kara's framework? Draft goes out Thursday. It's better than I expected. She'd already been thinking about this problem informally. She just needed someone to tell her it was worth formalizing. Another pause. Mason, Evelyn said. Yeah. Richard Amara called me today. The board member who voted against. He waited. He'd heard through someone in operations about the whiteboard situation, about what happened with Theo. She paused. He said, and I'm quoting him directly here, that he still thought I'd made an impulsive decision, but that he was prepared to be shown he was wrong. That's fair, Mason said. I thought you'd have more reaction to that. He was reasonable to vote against. He didn't have enough information to vote for. Mason set his coffee mug on the counter. I'd rather earn his confidence than have it on credit. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then, most people who've just been appointed to a senior executive role don't frame it as something to be earned after the fact. Most people in senior executive roles haven't had a CEO show up to terminate them 2 weeks before they took the job, Mason said. The sound on the other end of the line was unambiguously a laugh this time. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway in pajamas, holding a book she'd already read twice and wanted to read a third time. She looked at her father on the phone and tilted her head with a 9-year-old's complete absence of subtlety in the direction of the book, which was her signal for, I can't sleep, and I need you to read to me, but I don't want to interrupt if it's important. I have to go, Mason told Evelyn. Go, she said. Emma needs, go, Mason. I'll see you Thursday. He hung up and looked at his daughter leaning in the doorway. Chapter 3 again? He asked. Chapter 4, Emma said. Chapter 3 was last time. I thought you liked Chapter 3. I like Chapter 4 more, she said, with the absolute conviction of someone who had thought about this carefully. The part where they find the map. He took the book from her and followed her down the hallway and sat on the edge of her bed and read Chapter 4 while she lay with her eyes getting heavier, the dog occupying the lower third of the bed in the boneless way of a dog that had claimed territory by weight rather than negotiation. He read until he was sure she was asleep, which took longer than it used to. She was 9, not 6, and sleep came less automatically now, the mind staying active longer before it let go. He watched her face go slack and still in the dark of the room and sat there for a moment before he got up. That was the shape of the weeks that followed. The days were sterling dynamics, the floor, the work, the careful, incremental process of dismantling a culture of avoidance and replacing it with something that felt to Mason more like what an engineering team was supposed to feel like. Not comfortable, not frictionless, alive. He ran the first formal design review in week 3, and it went badly in ways that were instructive. 2 of the senior engineers, men who had been at the company for 7 and 9 years respectively, and who had, Mason suspected, been waiting for the new executive to reveal himself as someone they could wait out, pushed back on his review methodology with the particular stubbornness of people who'd had more years in a chair than he had, and thought that mattered more than it did. The meeting ran 40 minutes over. Voices were raised, not quite to the level of shouting, but in the range where the absence of shouting felt deliberate. Mason didn't raise his. He listened to both men make their cases, and then he went through both cases point by point with the same systematic precision he applied to every technical problem, and by the end of it, neither man had been vindicated, and both of them knew it, and the room knew it, and there was a particular discomfort to knowing it publicly. After the meeting, the older of the two, a man named Gerald Pratt, 51, who had been with Sterling Dynamics since before Evelyn took over, came to Mason's desk. That was a hard meeting, Gerald said. Yes, Mason agreed. You could have handled it differently. I could have, Mason said. What outcome would you have wanted from a different handling? Gerald was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man who had come to continue an argument and found the argument he'd prepared wasn't the one being offered. We've had a lot of new managers through here, he said. They come in with big ideas. After 6 months, they're managing upward instead of leading the team. That's a reasonable concern based on what you've seen, Mason said. He leaned back in his chair and looked at Gerald directly. I'm not going to tell you I'm different. I'm going to be here in 6 months, and you can tell me what you think then. Gerald looked at him for a long moment, looked at the notebook on Mason's desk, open to a page dense with handwritten notes from the review, looked at the technical drawing Mason had been working on before the meeting, which was spread on the desk with 3 different colored pens marking different revision stages. You actually work, Gerald said. The observation seemed slightly surprised. Yes, Mason said. Not just review. No. Gerald looked at the drawing again. What's that for? Revised intake manifold routing for the GT development program, Mason said. Your current routing is creating a resonance frequency problem at high RPM that nobody's identified yet because the testing hasn't been run at the right temperature range. He turned the drawing so Gerald could see it better. The fix is straightforward once you see it. Gerald leaned over and looked at the drawing for a long moment. The 90-degree elbow at Station 4? Gerald said slowly. That's the source, Mason said. Yes. Gerald was quiet. He studied the drawing with the focused expression of someone whose professional instincts had been activated despite their resistance. You'd need to reroute around the firewall bracket, he said. I know. I've got 3 options for that. Mason turned a page in his notebook to where he'd sketched the bracket options. Gerald looked at them. He straightened up, and something in his posture was slightly different than it had been when he'd arrived. Not deferential, that wasn't Gerald Pratt's way, but the defensive rigidity was gone, replaced by something more neutral. I'll look at the GT testing data, Gerald said. I'd appreciate that, Mason said. I want a second set of eyes on the resonance calculation before I bring it to the team. Gerald picked up his coffee mug from where he'd set it on the desk corner, looked like he was going to say something else, and then apparently decided not to. He walked back to his station. Mason watched him go and then turned back to his notebook. That was the shape of the reclamation too, say. Not dramatic. Not a single moment where everything turned. Just the incremental, unglamorous work of earning trust from people who had learned not to extend it easily. Some of them came around quickly. Others took time. A few, one in particular, a mid-level engineer named Brad Sutter, who seemed constitutionally allergic to being managed by anyone under 45, remained resistant in ways that Mason chose, deliberately, to leave alone for now. You couldn't fix everything at once. The attempt to fix everything at once was usually how you fixed nothing. Evelyn saw most of it from a careful distance. She had been explicit with herself, in the private way of someone setting rules they intend to keep, that she would not micromanage the engineering floor. She'd gotten a report every Thursday afternoon, in person, in her office, and she asked questions and listened to answers, and occasionally pushed back, and Mason occasionally pushed back on her pushback, and they usually arrived somewhere neither of them had started, which was, Evelyn thought, the sign of a functional professional relationship, both people ending the conversation slightly different than they began it. She noticed things she hadn't expected. The engineering floor had always been a reasonably quiet space, productive in its way, but with the specific quiet of people keeping their heads down. By the end of Mason's 3rd week, the noise level had changed, not louder in an unfocused way, louder in the way of people arguing about work, the constructive, heated, intellectually engaged kind of argument that happened when people believed their opinions were worth expressing. She heard it once while walking past the floor on her way to a different meeting and stopped outside the glass door to listen for a moment. Mason's voice in there somewhere, steady and specific, and 3 or 4 other voices around it in various states of enthusiasm. She walked on. She was smiling slightly and was aware of it and allowed herself that without examining it too closely. The mentorship program launched in Mason's 4th week. He'd designed it over 3 evenings at the kitchen table after Emma was asleep, the same kitchen table where he worked on the car's engineering problems, which Emma had complained more than once was where she was supposed to do her homework. The program paired each junior engineer with a senior one, but not. And Mason had been particular about this, drawing on his own experience more than he'd intended to. Not with the most technically impressive senior engineer on the team, with the best communicator, with the person most likely to be patient, with the person who remembered what it felt like to not know something yet. Theo Marsh was paired with Gerald Pratt, which Mason had spent 20 minutes on and which turned out, in practice, to be either a stroke of insight or a spectacular mistake that worked out anyway. Gerald was not a natural teacher. He was exact, he was impatient, and he had very high standards that he sometimes forgot to make explicit before evaluating people against them. But Theo was not easily intimidated and had a specific kind of dogged patience with people who were difficult in ways they weren't fully aware of. Possibly, Mason thought, because he'd spent years working under a management structure that was the same. They irritated each other productively, which was sometimes better than getting along. Kara Liu was paired with Mason himself, which had been Evelyn's suggestion. "You said she's one of the sharpest on the floor," Evelyn had said during one of their Thursday meetings. "Who's going to mentor the sharpest person, if not you?" "I was going to pair her with someone who could help with her communication style," Mason said. "She's technically excellent, but she loses the room when she's explaining complex things." "And who better to help with that than someone who does it himself?" Evelyn said. He'd looked at her for a moment. "That's a more pointed observation than you're letting on." "I know," she said. He paired himself with Kara. The Thursday afternoon meetings became something that Mason didn't anticipate and wasn't sure what to do with initially, which was something he looked forward to. Not because the content was always easy. Some of those meetings were genuinely difficult, navigating board pressure or budget constraints or personnel situations that had no clean answers. But because the quality of the thinking that happened in them was unlike anything he'd been part of in the 4 years since he'd left professional engineering. Evelyn was not, as he'd initially been prepared to find, someone who had ascended to leadership by being good at managing up. She was a genuine thinker. She'd sacrificed depth for breadth in some areas. Her technical knowledge had the specific holes of someone who'd been too busy running a company to keep every specialization current. But her instincts about systems, about how things failed and why, were sharp in a way that he respected without deciding to tell her he respected it. She probably knew anyway. She noticed most things. The result that Richard Amar had been waiting for came in week 6, when the thermal testing on Theo's cooling prototype came back and the numbers weren't just viable. They were a 12% improvement over the current architecture, which translated at Sterling Dynamics production volumes to a cost reduction significant enough that Patricia Cho sent Evelyn an email at 10:30 on a Tuesday night that said only, "I understand now. P." Evelyn forwarded it to Mason the next morning with no comment added. He read it at his desk on the engineering floor, with Kara standing beside him reviewing the assumption validation framework revision they'd been working on together. And he set his phone down and looked at the technical drawing in front of him and felt something quiet and specific, not pride, or not only pride. Something closer to the feeling in the garage when a calculation that had resisted him for weeks finally resolved. The satisfaction of a thing that was supposed to work, working. "Good news?" Kara asked, glancing at his phone. "A board member changed her mind," he said. Kara looked at him. "About you?" "About whether this was worth trying," he said. "She considered this." "And?" "She thinks it is." Kara turned back to the framework document. "She's right," she said, with the simple certainty of someone stating a technical fact. Not a compliment, just an assessment. Mason picked up his pen and went back to work. On Callaway Street, the garage sat mostly dark on weeknights now. Not always. Mason was still out there 2 or 3 nights a week, still working toward the rear wing's final fitment, still running the last of the checks that needed to be run before the car could be called finished in any real sense. But the hours were shorter than they used to be, partly because the work itself was genuinely nearing its end, and partly because he was tired in a way that was different from the old tiredness. The old tiredness had been the tiredness of someone carrying something alone for a long time. This was something more ordinary, the tiredness of days that were full. Emma noticed the change without saying so directly, which was her way of saying so. She came out to the garage one evening, a Thursday, and sat on her stool and watched her father work for a while without the usual running commentary. And after maybe 20 minutes, she said, "You seem different." Mason looked up from the rear wing mounting bracket. Different how? She thought about it with the specific gravity of a 9-year-old taking a question seriously. "Like, you know where you're going," she said. "You always kind of knew where you were going with the car, but now it's like—" She searched. "Like you know where you're going in the morning, too." He looked at his daughter sitting on the workbench stool with grass-stained socks dangling over the edge, the dog asleep at her feet, the October light coming in flat and orange through the garage door. "Yeah," he said. "Something like that." She accepted this and looked at the rear wing assembly he was working on. "Is it almost done?" "Getting there," he said. She nodded slowly, looking at the car the way she always had. Not with a child's unfocused wonder, but with the particular familiar attention of someone who had watched this thing grow their entire life and understood it in a way that wasn't entirely technical and wasn't entirely not. "Good," she said, and picked up the book she'd brought out with her and began to read. Mason turned back to the mounting bracket. Outside, the street was quiet. Somewhere down the block, a neighbor's porch light came on against the darkening sky. The dog made a small sound in its sleep and was still again. He worked for another hour, in the particular silence of a garage that had learned to hold two people comfortably, and the car, Frank Hale's unfinished dream, Mason Hale's 6-year reckoning, the thing that had kept him company through every version of loss and starting over and getting back up, sat in the light and waited for what was coming. The rear wing went on during the last weekend of October. Mason had been working toward it for 3 evenings that week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, each session ending later than the one before, not because the work demanded it, but because he kept finding himself unwilling to stop. He recognized the feeling. It was the same one he'd had at the end of long build cycles in professional racing, that particular reluctance that came when you were close enough to see the finish and far enough that rushing would ruin it. His father had called it the last mile problem. The closer you got, the more careful you had to be, because the mistakes you made in the last 10% of a build were the ones most likely to matter. So he was careful. He torqued every fastener to spec and then checked it again. He ran the wiring harness for the rear wing's data sensors 3 times before he was satisfied with the routing. He checked the attachment points against the original design specification, his father's handwriting on a page that had been handled enough times to go soft at the folds, and then against his own revised calculations, and compared them, and found that they agreed closely enough to feel like a conversation across 6 years. Saturday morning, he put the wing on. It took him 40 minutes, working alone, and when the last fastener was seated and torqued and the wing sat on the car at exactly the angle he'd calculated, and the whole rear aerodynamic assembly was finally, actually, genuinely complete, he stood back and looked at the car in the morning light coming through the open garage door and felt something that he wasn't going to try to name because naming it would make it smaller than it was. He took a photograph, just one, with his phone, nothing staged. The car in the garage exactly as it was, oil rags on the workbench, his coffee mug on the floor where he'd set it, the soft morning light doing what it wanted. He looked at the photograph for a moment and then sent it to one person. Evelyn's reply came back in 4 minutes. "When?" He typed back, 2 weeks, maybe 3. Her response? "I'll be there." He put his phone in his pocket and went inside to make Emma breakfast. The 2 weeks that followed were the final systems checks, electrical, fuel, cooling, all of it gone through with the same methodical patience that had characterized every stage of the build. Mason did most of it alone, the way he'd done most of the build alone, though Carol came out one Saturday and sat on Emma's stool and watched him work without offering opinions, which from Carol was a form of profound respect. She brought coffee and a container of food he didn't need to heat up and left both on the workbench without making it into anything. "It looks like his car," she said, at some point in the middle of the morning. "It's supposed to," Mason said. "I mean, it looks exactly like the drawings he used to have on his wall," she said, "in the old house, before you were born even. He had drawings everywhere." Mason looked at the car. He hadn't known that. Or rather, He'd known his father had drawn obsessively throughout his career, but he hadn't known the drawings that became this car had existed before Mason was born. That changed the math of it in some way he couldn't quite articulate. The thing predated him. His father had been carrying this idea for longer than Mason had been alive, and Mason had spent 6 years finishing it, and none of that time, laid end to end, felt wasted. "Does it feel like what you thought it would?" Carol asked. He thought about it honestly because she deserved an honest answer. "I don't know yet," he said. "Ask me after I drive it." She nodded and drank her coffee and didn't ask anything else. At Sterling Dynamics, the weeks moved differently, faster, denser, with the specific momentum of an engineering culture that was beginning to remember what it was for. The assumption validation framework Kara had developed was now a formal part of every review process. Theo's cooling architecture prototype had cleared its final evaluation and was moving into production consideration. The GT development program, where Mason had identified the resonance frequency problem in the intake manifold routing, had been revised and retested, and the new configuration performed exactly as his calculations had predicted, which Gerald Pratt acknowledged in a team review meeting with a single, brief nod in Mason's direction that translated, in Gerald's emotional vocabulary, to something approximating a standing ovation. Brad Sutter, the engineer who'd remained resistant longest, handed in his resignation in the 3rd week of November. He did it professionally, without hostility, and Mason received it the same way. He didn't try to talk Brad out of it. Some people found a new management approach a reason to stay and grow, and some people found it a reason to conclude that the environment no longer suited them, and Brad had concluded the latter with clarity and self-knowledge. And Mason respected that even if he couldn't tell Brad so directly. He wished him well. He meant it. The junior engineer who stepped into the gap Brad left was a 24-year-old named Yusuf Okafor. No relation to Emma's teacher, a coincidence that Emma found hilarious and Mason found mildly disorienting, who had been in a junior support role and whose work Mason had been watching for 3 weeks with the specific attention he gave to people who were doing more than their job description asked without making anything of it. He was not the obvious choice. He was the right one. Kara Liu's presentation skills improved over 6 weeks in ways that surprised even her. Or rather, Mason suspected they'd always been there, just suppressed by an environment that had never made space for them. He watched her run a technical briefing in week 7 that held the attention of every person in the room, including Gerald, and thought about the things his father used to say about engineers who could think and communicate being twice as valuable as engineers who could only do one. He'd thought it was a cliché when his father said it. He'd been wrong about that. Richard Amara came to the engineering floor for the first time in his tenure as a board member in the 4th week of November. He'd arranged it through Evelyn, quietly, without making it an official board activity. He arrived on a Tuesday morning and spent 2 hours walking the floor with Mason, asking the kind of questions that told Mason he'd done his homework. Not softballs, not the polite inquiries of someone going through the motions, but real technical questions that required real answers. Mason gave him real answers, including in 2 cases the honest answer that he didn't know yet and was still working on it, which Richard seemed to value more than a confident wrong response would have. Before he left, Richard stood at the floor's central whiteboard, the same one where Theo's proposal had sat untouched for 3 weeks before Mason arrived, and looked at what was on it now. 3 active proposals, a systems diagram for the GT revision, and a timeline for a new project that Kara's team had formally proposed the previous week. "It's different," Richard said. "Yes," Mason said. "You did this in 8 weeks." "The team did it," Mason said. "They were already capable. They just needed the permission." Richard looked at him with the steady, assessing eyes of a man who had been evaluating people for 40 years. "That's a more generous reading than most executives would give themselves." "It's the accurate one," Mason said. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I voted against hiring you." "I know. I was wrong." Mason said nothing. "You're not going to tell me not to worry about it," Richard observed. "No," Mason said, "but I appreciate you saying it directly." Richard looked at the whiteboard one more time. "Good work," he said, and left the way he'd come, without ceremony, which Mason respected. He called Evelyn on the drive home that evening and told her about Richard's visit. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "He didn't tell me he was going." "I know, he told me after." "What did he say, exactly?" "That he was wrong," Mason said. Another silence. "Richard Amara has been on 3 corporate boards in 40 years, Evelyn said. "I have never heard him say he was wrong about a personnel decision. Not once." "There's a first time," Mason said. He could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, and in the texture of it, something that wasn't quite professional and wasn't quite personal. The specific quality of a person trying to contain something that didn't fit neatly into either category. "Mason," she said. "Yeah." "I'm glad I drove to Calloway Street," she said. He watched the road for a moment. A stoplight ahead cycling to red. The evening coming in dark and cold around the car. "So am I," he said. The first Saturday in December arrived cold and clear, the kind of morning that felt like it had been made specifically for something outdoor and irreversible. Mason was in the garage by 6:30. Emma was still asleep. He told her the night before, with the careful understatement of someone who didn't want to put a weight on something that might not hold it, that he was probably going to drive the car today if everything checked out in the morning. Emma had looked at him with an expression he'd seen before, the one she wore when she was taking something seriously enough not to make noise about it. "Okay," she'd said. "You can come if you want," he said. "Or sleep in." She gave him the look that said sleeping in was not a consideration. He spent the first 2 hours of the morning doing final systems checks for the 4th time, not because he thought he'd missed anything, but because the alternative was starting the engine, and he wasn't quite ready for the car to become real in that particular way. It had been real in every stage of its construction, real as a chassis, real as a rolling assembly, real as an aerodynamic project, real as the thing he came to in the dark after his daughter was asleep. But running was different. Running was the version of real that his father had wanted and not reached, and Mason sat with that for 2 hours in the cold garage while the light came up outside, and the birds made their various Saturday morning arguments in the trees on Calloway Street. Emma appeared at the garage door at 8:45 with 2 mugs of coffee. She'd started making coffee in the last few months, badly at first, and now with the specific competence of someone who had received corrections and applied them, and the dog trailing behind her with the vague optimism of an animal that had learned that garage mornings sometimes involved interesting activity. She set one mug on the workbench beside her father and sat on her stool and wrapped both hands around the other mug and looked at the car. "Today," she said. Not a question. "Today," he confirmed. She looked at the car for a long moment. 9 years old, and she'd watched this thing from the time she was 3, which meant she had no memory of the garage without it, no baseline of what the space had looked like before her grandfather's unfinished project had taken up residence in it, and consequently taken up residence in the whole shape of their life. "Are you scared?" she asked. He looked at her. She was looking at the car, not at him, which meant she was asking because she actually wanted the answer, not because she was managing him. "A little," he said. "Yeah," she nodded slowly. "Grandpa Frank would be scared too," she said, "but excited scared. Not bad scared." He looked at his daughter. He thought about the essay folded in the breast pocket of his work shirt, which was now folded in the drawer of his dresser because he still hadn't found the right place to put it, but which he hadn't thrown away and wasn't going to. "Yeah," he said. "That's about right." Evelyn arrived at 9:15. He'd given her the address of a private airfield 20 minutes outside the city, a small facility with a long, straight service road that a contact of his father's had used for exactly this kind of first-run test, and had offered Mason when he called to say the car was almost ready, with the warmth of an old friend of Frank Hale's who had been waiting 6 years for that specific phone call. Mason had loaded the car onto a borrowed trailer the previous afternoon, and it was already there, sitting in the morning light on the concrete apron outside the small maintenance hangar, when Evelyn's car pulled through the gate. She stepped out and stood for a moment looking at the car in the full light of a clear December morning, in the open, away from the garage and the neighborhood and the context of Calloway Street. Outside of that context, it was even more apparent what it was, something that had no right to exist at this level of refinement without a professional team and a serious budget, And yet here it was, sitting in the pale winter sunlight on a borrowed airfield, exactly as complete and exactly as extraordinary as it had been in the garage, just more visible. Carol was there, standing to one side with a thermos. Theo Marsh had come, at Mason's invitation, with the slightly stunned expression of someone who hadn't entirely believed the car was what Mason had said it was until he was looking at it. Kara had come with him and stood with her arms crossed against the cold with the particular focused attention she brought to everything, looking at the aerodynamic elements with the expression of someone reading a technical document and finding it better than expected. Gerald Pratt was there too. Mason had called him on Thursday, which had surprised Gerald enough that he'd asked Mason to repeat the address twice. He stood apart from the others with his coffee and looked at the car with no expression at all, which from Gerald meant he was moved and had no intention of showing it. Emma stood closest to the car. She'd worn her good coat and the boots she saved for things that mattered, which told Mason she'd been thinking about today as something that mattered since the night before, though she hadn't said so. Mason did a final walk-around in front of everyone, which felt more ceremonial than he intended, and which he didn't know how to make less so. He checked the tire pressures, checked the brake fluid level through the reservoir, looked at the aerodynamic elements one last time. The front wing with its cascade elements, the side pod inlets, the rear diffuser with its resolved strakes, the wing he'd fitted 2 weeks ago sitting at exactly the angle his calculations said it should. He thought about his father. Not in a cinematic way. Not the way a moment like this was supposed to feel in the movies. He thought about him specifically. About his hands. About the way he used to stand when he was looking at a car he was proud of, with his arms slightly out from his sides, weight on his heels. About the phone call in September of 2020, come out this weekend, I've got something I can't figure out, that Mason had deferred by 7 days and then never made. He'd been living with that for 6 years. He thought he'd probably live with it for the rest of his life, which was not the same as being broken by it. Some things you didn't get over, you just found a way to carry them that let you keep moving. He pulled on his helmet, his father's old helmet, refurbished with a new liner, the original paint scheme underneath still visible if you looked, and folded himself into the cockpit. The seat fit him better than it should have, given that he'd built it to a specification that was partly his father's dimension and partly his own. He'd made compromises in the geometry that turned out in practice to be exactly right. He'd stopped being surprised by things like that. He ran through the startup sequence from memory. Fuel pump on, ignition check. The engine turned over on the second crank. He'd expected 3, and caught with a sound that was nothing like a road car and nothing like an airplane, and was exactly what it was. A small displacement, high-revving, naturally aspirated engine built with specific intention and given very little room to be anything other than what it was designed to be. The sound filled the airfield in a way that was disproportionate to the engine's size. It wasn't loud by the standards of professional motorsport. It was the right kind of loud, the kind that felt like information, like the machine telling you what it was and what it intended. Emma's hands went to her mouth, not in distress, in the way of someone who has heard something they've been waiting for so long that the reality of it is physically surprising. Mason sat in the car for 30 seconds, with the engine running, listening. Not to the exhaust note, though the exhaust note was exactly right. To everything else, the vibration through the chassis, the fuel pressure, the temperature gauges climbing at the rate they were supposed to climb, the absence of any sound that wasn't supposed to be there. He'd been over this car 10,000 times, and he would have heard a wrong note in it the way you heard a wrong note in a song you'd memorized. There was no wrong note. He put it in gear and pulled slowly forward out of the apron area and onto the long, straight service road that ran the length of the airfield. He drove it at low speed for the first 300 meters, feeling the steering weight, the brake response, the way the car settled onto the road surface. His father's chassis design had always been intended to produce a specific quality of feedback. The car talking to the driver rather than filtering everything out, every imperfection in the surface coming up through the steering column, every aerodynamic load making itself felt. His father had believed that a driver who couldn't feel the car couldn't trust it, and a car you didn't trust you drove slowly, and a car you drove slowly was a waste of everything that went into it. The feedback was exactly what the design specified. He could feel the front downforce loading up as he pushed the speed higher. He could feel the rear stability that the diffuser geometry produced. Not the theoretical stability of a simulation, but the actual, physical, undeniable stability of a car that was pressing itself into the road rather than arguing with it. He pushed harder through the mid-range of the straight, and the car responded with the clean, linear acceleration of something that had very little weight and an engine that wanted to work. And at the far end of the straight, he braked and turned and came back slower, and stopped on the apron and sat in the car with the engine running for a moment before he shut it off. The silence after the engine stopped was profound. Not empty, full of what had just been in it. He climbed out of the cockpit. His legs were unsteady in the specific way of someone who has been holding themselves very still for an extended period and is now released from it. He pulled off the helmet and stood beside the car and breathed the cold December air and looked at what he'd built. Emma crossed the distance between them at a run and hit him at approximately sternum height, both arms around him, face pressed into his jacket. He put his arms around her and held on. She didn't say anything, neither did he. They stood there in the winter morning beside the car that was finally, after 6 years and one September phone call that he couldn't take back, and one stroke on a Tuesday, and 8 months, and a funeral, and a divorce, and a mechanic job with a 12-minute commute, and 4 years of notebooks and a CEO with a termination letter who'd walked into the wrong garage at the right time. They stood there beside the car that was finished. After a moment, Emma pulled back and looked up at him. Her eyes were wet, and she was not making anything of that. "Was it what you thought?" she asked. "Better," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and wiped her face with the back of her hand and turned to look at the car with the proprietary pride of someone who had been a witness to the whole thing and felt accordingly entitled to claim part of it. Carol arrived beside Mason and put her hand briefly on his back, one firm, wordless pressure, and then stepped away, because Carol had never been a person who required her emotional moments to last longer than they needed to. Evelyn had hung back while Emma ran to her father, which was the right thing to do, and which she'd done instinctively, which told Mason something about her that he filed away without comment. She came forward now and stood beside him looking at the car, and he stood beside her, and for a minute neither of them said anything. "Your father would have argued with you about the rear wing angle," she said finally. "For at least 2 hours," Mason agreed. "And then?" "And then he would have said it was fine," Mason said. "But he would have wanted me to know he'd seen the issue." Evelyn looked at the car, at the rear wing in particular, sitting at its calculated angle, the one that was correct and that Frank Hale would have had loud opinions about anyway, because that was who Frank Hale had been. A man who argued about things he believed in, including things he ultimately agreed with. "The essay Emma wrote," Evelyn said, "the last line." He knew which line she meant. "She was right," Evelyn said, "about what it means to finish something for someone." He didn't respond to that, not because he disagreed, but because some things didn't need a response. They needed to be acknowledged and then allowed to be what they were without anyone improving on them. Gerald had walked around to the rear of the car and was examining the diffuser with an expression that was, for Gerald, almost animated. Theo was crouched at the front wing taking a photograph. Kara was standing with her arms still crossed, looking at the overall form of the car with the expression of someone thinking about it structurally rather than emotionally, which was her particular way of paying attention and which Mason had come to recognize as a form of respect. It occurred to him, looking at these people in the cold morning light on a borrowed airfield, that the shape of his life 6 months ago and the shape of it now were almost incomparable. Not because the external circumstances had changed so dramatically. He was still Mason Hale, still Emma's father, still the man who'd driven a truck with a state park bumper sticker and kept composition notebooks and had lunch packed and ready by 7:15 on school days. He was still that. But he was also something again that he'd set aside in the grief and the rubble of 2020 and hadn't been sure he'd find his way back to. He was an engineer, the practicing kind, the kind who made things rather than only fixed them. He hadn't known how much he'd missed it until he was back inside it. He'd thought, in the darkest stretch of those 4 years, that he'd chosen between his daughter and his work, and that the choice was the right one, and he didn't regret it, and also that it had cost him something essential about himself that he wasn't going to recover. He'd been wrong about the last part. Not wrong that it cost him. It had. But the thing you paid for wasn't gone. It was waiting for the right conditions to come back, the way a perennial comes back in spring, whether or not you believed in winter that it would. Emma, Carol, a notebook in a garage and 6 years of work that had no audience and no deadline and no professional validation attached to it. And then, almost accidentally, a CEO, with a termination letter and a willingness, once she understood what she was looking at, to look honestly at her own assumptions and decide to do something different. None of it had been smooth. None of it had been the way it was supposed to go. He'd lost his father too early, his marriage in the wreckage that followed, his career in the space after that. He'd spent 4 years being excellent in a context that no one was watching. He was still, on most days, figuring out what he was doing as a parent, which he suspected was not a problem that resolved. Emma would outgrow the bicycle with the silver streamers and grow into something more complicated, and he would navigate that without a manual the same way he'd navigated everything else, by paying attention, by checking his assumptions, by being willing to be wrong and correcting when he was. He was not a man who had it figured out. He was a man who kept working. Evelyn stood beside him in the cold and didn't say anything, which was one of the things he'd come to value about her. The willingness to let a moment be a moment instead of narrating it. After a while, Emma came back to stand on his other side, close enough that her shoulder touched his arm. The three of them stood looking at the car in the winter light, and the airfield was quiet around them, and somewhere above the tree line at the field's edge, a pair of birds were doing something contentious and noisy, and the world was going on in its various directions with complete indifference to what had just happened on this strip of concrete, which was fine. Not everything needed an audience. Most of the things that mattered, Mason had come to understand, happened in garages late at night, with no one watching but a 9-year-old in pajamas at the door. Evelyn turned to him. There was something in her expression that she hadn't entirely resolved into a professional shape yet, which was the most human he'd seen her look, which was saying something given how far they'd traveled from that first Friday. "What happens now?" she said. It was a larger question than it sounded. He understood that. He looked at the car, at Emma, at the December sky going its pale blue overhead. "Same thing that was always going to happen," he said. "We keep working." Evelyn looked at him for a moment, and then something in her face settled, not into resolution exactly, but into the particular calm of someone who has been waiting for an answer and found that the answer they got was better than the ones they'd been preparing themselves for. "Okay," she said. And that was enough. That was exactly enough. The car sat in the winter light, finished. Frank Hale's drawings made real, 6 years after the man who'd drawn them lost the ability to hold a wrench. A debt that couldn't be fully paid, but could be honored, and had been, in the only currency that mattered, the work itself, done carefully, done honestly, done all the way to the end. Mason Hale had never wanted to be found. He hadn't been hiding, exactly. He'd just stopped putting himself where people who were looking would think to look. And maybe that was its own kind of hiding, the kind that comes not from shame, but from exhaustion, from having been misread enough times that you stop correcting the misreading. The thing about being genuinely seen, not praised, not promoted, just accurately seen, was that it didn't require a dramatic moment. It required one person deciding that the information they had wasn't enough and asking the next question. Just one person, just the willingness to ask. Everything else had followed from that. He put his arm around Emma's shoulders and felt her lean into him. And the dog, who had somehow ended up at the airfield despite no clear memory of anyone deciding to bring him, sat down on Mason's foot with the full confident weight of an animal that had located the warmest available thing and made its decision. Mason looked at the car one last time. Then he looked at his daughter. "You want to drive home?" he asked. Emma looked up at him. "I'm 9, she said. "I know, figure of speech." "You should say what you mean," she said, which was something he had told her approximately 100 times, and which she deployed back at him with the precision of someone who had been storing ammunition. "Fair point," he said. They walked back to the car together, the dog between them in the quiet December morning on a borrowed airfield, after finishing the thing that was supposed to be finished. Nothing about it was perfect. Everything about it was right.